Oops.
Oh, well, but only 15 minutes.
Okay, looks like we're all back. You folks want to share some of the insights that y'all shared in your rooms?
Hi, this is Celia Sorkin from Maryland. And I think that there's authenticity and credibility that youth peer support share with their experience, lived experience in a purposeful way with youth versus a family member speaking on the youth's behalf. The family member has, and I'm a executive director of the Federation of Families. I have two adults now with behavioral health challenges. And, both my children who are adults, they have their own perspective, their own value system, their own beliefs, and they connect with, and when they're growing up through the system of care, they connected with their peers. And, my perspective came from my own arena, my struggles, my needs as a family member, my frustrations. And sometimes what my children wanted, especially as transition age youth, was very different than what I wanted.
Absolutely.
And that's valid.
Yeah,
Because it's their
definitely.
lives.
I think, yeah, I appreciate what you say about like that authenticity and connection that will happen when they're sharing with youth versus with family members, because it's really coming from a different sort of perspective, right? So yeah, that's some great insight. Thank you, Celia. Does anybody else want to share?
Looks like Andrea wrote in the chat, when sharing pieces of my lived experiences with a youth, I don't feel like I'm proving anything. Often when I'm sharing my lived experience with their family members, it's to try to give them a new perspective that could give them more understanding to the youth I'm working with.
Yeah, I think that's some great insight.
Yeah, I think that I love what you said about proving something, because I think when you're sharing with young people, you might not always be thinking about like, oh, what's the purpose behind this? It's more about like that authenticity and just that connection. It might just feel more natural, but with a parent, you're really going to be keeping like that strategy of the strategic sharing in mind. What am I, what is my goal to gain from the strategic sharing, right? And you're going to probably be a lot more, thoughtful about what you share. Let's see, and Madison said, our group talked about how our goals are going to be different and our language is going to be much different. Also, the extent to which we disclose may be different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's something that happens, even from like youth to youth and person to person, right? What you share might be different. And it's sort of the aim for the conversation might be a little different. I know that when I was working with young people, some youth that I would share certain parts of my story with, and then other youth I wouldn't, because it wasn't really relevant to their situation, right? And so that's one of our strategic sharing tips, is really only share parts of your story that are relevant. This is so that we can make sure that what we're sharing is actually there to be purposeful for the young person or whomever else we might be sharing with, rather than centering ourselves in the situation. We do want to avoid oversharing, as this might be activating for the youth. Also, there are certain studies that show that if you're sharing about certain things, so one of them being attempts at suicide, if you disclose like the methodology for your attempt or things like that, that can actually be really triggering for a young person who is also experiencing suicidal ideation. So we want to really be careful about, how are we sharing our stories, and making sure that it's not with the purpose of us being able to talk about it, but it's with the purpose of being able to help the young person or help advocate in the situation. Also, really, you don't have to share all of your story all of the time. When I first started as a youth peer, nobody really told me that. And so it felt like other people, especially folks that I was working with, felt really entitled to my story and would ask me about it a lot. So I really want to support youth peers. You only have to share parts of your story that you want to share. Your story is your own, and something that I know I sort of had to work on and get over is because I was so used to having to share my story with new professionals in my life when I was a youth, that then when I was an adult working in this role and people would ask me about it, it kind of like reactivated that behavior for me. I want to really highlight that, youth peers, your story is a tool in your toolbox that you're using to help your young people and to advocate in different systems. You don't need to share when you don't feel like it, or share parts of your story that you don't feel like sharing. And then additionally, make sure that you're still taking care of yourself. I know a lot of youth peers are pretty comfortable sharing their story. Obviously, we're trained to do so and asked to do so, and it's what we sign up for. But it's also okay that maybe one day that you were comfortable sharing, the next day you really weren't. So do some self-care after sharing, or think about what it is that you need after sharing or revisiting parts of your story. Maria, would you add anything?
Yeah, I just think it's really good to talk these things through with your supervisor ahead of time. And if you are a supervisor, really like help your youth peers think about this, because it can be really hard when you're put on the spot in those situations, like Caitlin just mentioned, when professionals think, I think this comes a lot from other professionals who don't necessarily understand the peer role, or the one thing they know about the peer role is that, they have lived experience in systems. So, they have that natural curiosity about what your lived experience is. But, when someone's asking you a question like, oh, can you share what your story is? I think a lot of us who are like more like people pleasery might just feel like inclined to just share it, and then afterwards feel kind of, like maybe just used or exploited from that moment. And I know I've been in that situation. I was just to share a personal anecdote, when I used to work as a program manager at a youth peer sport drop-in center, I was giving a presentation on like substance abuse resources in the county, and I had mentioned that I had lived experience in addiction and recovery. And like afterwards, when I asked for questions, when the professional said, can you share your addiction story? And I just was standing in front of a room full of people and felt really put on the spot. So I just shared a really kind of clipped version of it. And then afterwards I was like, why did I do that? I didn't need to, So after that, I kind of felt like I needed to have more of a plan and have some, kind of phrases in my pocket to say when those kind of things came up. And, to know personally that people weren't necessarily entitled to parts of my story that I didn't want to share, especially in contexts like that. And that, like Caitlin said, your story is just one tool in your toolbox, right? There's a lot of different skills that make me a professional. It's not just, that I was in recovery or had experience in the mental health system. So I wasn't really there to talk about that. So I just encourage everyone to really think ahead of time, like what parts of your story you want to share, in what context, and then just work with your supervisor to practice maybe things you might want to say in those kind of situations. Lisa said, it feels exploitive and under-supportive. Most people do not use payable language either. Equity and ending exploitation means people have control over their story and their voice. We have workshops to help people learn how to not answer or return to talking points. What talking points are, etc., what pays and what doesn't, how to take pieces, our story and break it down to education and presentation and best practices for pay. Yeah, sharing a story and experience is consulting work. Yeah, we practice for these moments. The plan is always great. Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Lisa, if you want to drop a link in the chat to some of those workshops or anything, we encourage you to do that. That would be awesome. And we can send them in a follow-up email after this as well. Okay, so we have another discussion and we're going to put you back in your breakout rooms. We're going to mix up the breakout room, so you'll be with a new group this time as well. And our discussion question is, what might be some challenges when sharing one's lived experience? Okay, so you should receive an invitation to your room. And you'll have about 5 minutes for this discussion as well. Could you hear Jude hawking up a hairball when I was talking?
No.
Okay, good. I'm gonna pretend that's not happening.
I'm not sure if the breakout room that I was in just didn't have any people in it, or if my connection is so poor that I can't hear anyone else. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Do you know which breakout room you were in? Are you still there? Mm-mm.
Can you still hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Okay. Did you hear that I was in group 4? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I didn't. Okay, so you're in group 4. Let's see. So it looks like Caitlin stepped away, and since I'm not a host, I can't put you back in there. If she comes back, I'll have her move you to a different one and see if that helps. It might have been a connection problem, or it might have been that just an issue with the rooms.
Okay. If you want, I can explain what I think about it to
Sure,
you,
yeah.
if that's helpful. So I think the hardest part about sharing with the youth would, I mean, for me, what I have not necessarily anxiety about, but something that I fear to happen is like to to be able to share something in a way that it is like not too much for them, like kind of like the oversharing that we were just going over, but like making it in a way that they can take away something from it in a positive way.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So just kind of like how to make sure that you're sharing something that's like going to be helpful, right?
Yeah, well, like I don't know. I feel like I had to learn a lot of the hard way growing up, and that's not something that like I want other youth to like go through. So like making it more adaptable, I don't know, easier to learn from, I guess, without them having to go through like the hard stuff, or making it seem like I wouldn't be able to like get through it if I didn't go through the hard stuff, you know?
Oh yeah, totally. Caitlin, Amber was having trouble with her breakout room, or maybe with the connection, or maybe there was no one in there. We're not sure.
Okay. Well, I mean, it sounds like you all were having a really great discussion.
Yeah,
So
she just shared with me her thoughts.
yeah. Yeah, and Amber, from what I heard, I can totally relate. I had a lot of anxiety about like, well, what if I share this piece and this is actually more like something that's going to be activating to the youth rather than helpful to the young person, you know?
Yeah,
It took me a long
exactly.
time to kind of like find that balance.
That was a better way to put it.
I thought you put it wonderfully.
Thank you. I also wanted to apologize because my camera has been off, and I left another meeting late, and it's kind of like rippled effect. So I'm like on my way driving home, and that's why my service is so crappy. But usually I have my camera on, so I apologize.
Oh, no worries at all. Zoom fatigue is real. Like there are times where my brain just doesn't want it. So I never even question when people need to have their cameras off.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, and especially if you're driving, you know, less distraction, the better. So,
Yeah.
okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close everyone's room. Okay, looks like we're all back. Would anybody like to share some of the discussion that came up in your breakout room?
This is Celia, we talked in our breakout room that there's a whole continuum of how comfortable youth peers feel in sharing. Some are very open and feel, that there aren't necessarily unintended consequences to their sharing, while others may be re-traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a question, and maybe you guys can answer it better than me. One person asked, are youth peers currently in therapy? And I said it varies across the nation. Some are, some aren't. And some could be supervised by other peers, and some could be supervised by clinicians. And the supervision may take a different style or a different approach because the supervisor is coming from a certain perspective. So I didn't know if you feel similarly.
Yeah, actually, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. So, I mean, I know my entire time as a youth peer, and now as an adult, I'm still in therapy. There are plenty of people, who continue on with therapy and their recovery in all sorts of professions, right? And youth peers are no different than that. Additionally, some youth peers are supervised by other peers, some are supervised by clinicians, some are supervised by both. I know that when I was a youth peer supervisor for our youth peers who were serving young people in wraparound, we would do dual supervision sessions. So I would supervise them, and then they had a clinical supervisor who was who oversaw like their teams in their counties, where they would get basically just more information if there were particular diagnoses or especially any, safety concerns or things like that. But then in terms of actually how to do their job, that was my role as their supervisor, right? And to make sure that they're doing things like they have a good self-care plan, and that we're checking in about any of the peerness aspects of that role. So yeah, and then some youth peers, if you're not working with young people in a clinical setting, then there's probably not a need for a clinical supervisor, right? So.
And I think one shouldn't judge. I mean, if someone is working in a workplace and they have, a 60-year-old and they have depression, people aren't, their supervisor isn't going around saying, are you well enough to participate in this meeting? Or it's stigmatizing, and there shouldn't be judgment, and not, and to say that someone should be in therapy is judgmental. It should be self-choice. And some youth peers feel that it hasn't helped them, or it's been detrimental, or they're at a different place in their lives that they don't need it. So I think there are a lot of assumptions and implicit biases that are brought to the table in thinking that we have to save these group of young peers. They're professionals and they have free choice. And we can't build these biases in our interactions and our prejudices.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as I said before, there are people in all sorts of professions who are in some sort of recovery process, right? And youth peers are no different in that way. And we don't ask other people in other professions if we know about their recovery process. We don't offer our own opinions or judgment on that, right? We shouldn't do it with youth peers either.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
One of the things that came up for us was a lack of preparation and informed choice for the people being asked to speak quite often. Quite often, I've seen across the movement and across the United States, people lifted and elevated really quickly, brought into conferences. We are not considering racial inequities. Quite often, a lot of our children aging out of young adults aging out of services are of color, and we're bringing them to all white spaces.
Mm-hmm.
We're not providing wraparound services. We're not talking to them about that they have rights and limits, and if they actually own that space and can assign what questions are allowed to be asked, they can put a lot of protections in place, and we're just bringing them into spaces for our own needs. And that might not be their need or their purpose. And we're also asking, regardless of race, we often ask them to assimilate to our audiences, and therefore we do not get the vast diversity and juiciness of the real education that we need. We're asking them to shape up their story so the audience can be comfortable, and yet that is where we lose most of the education, because that is where we deliver 101 trauma vomit stuff again. And where we're just, it feels like performative versus educational. The other piece, and I'm gonna bring it back to exploitive, quite often, they are the only non-paid person in the room. The entire audience is paid. The camera person is paid. They bring in extra talent. The singer is paid. The person who is not paid is the person bringing expert experience and consultation.
That's absolutely true. I know that both Marie and I have seen quite a few examples of where community members might reach out to us and say, like, can you bring youth to this event? And we would have to come back to them and say, like, well, like, what are youth being paid to do so? Because it's not equitable. And we expect young people, and I agree with you, Lisa, especially young people of color, to sort of come and perform their story at the comfort of white people and white professionals. There's actually, I can send out this resource afterwards, but there's a resource called the Heart's Ladder, where it really asks people to reflect on how are we equitably involving youth voice. And I think that I think a lot of people with good intentions oftentimes after reviewing this see that what they're actually doing is exploiting or tokenizing youth rather than actually equitably partnering with them. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
And I think like another thing that you made me think about is that when we're bringing young people into like these systems environment to share, we need to be preparing the young people, but we also need to be preparing the systems to, change their ways to accept the young people. So that can be, educating them on things like Heart's Ladder and what's tokenizing and not, and, helping them change their language to not be so systemy, not being using acronyms that the young people aren't going to understand, and, helping make the space more safe and more youth friendly, not having meetings at 10 in the morning where young people can't participate because they're in school, stuff like that. And just like making it a place where young people are going to be able to participate, because I think we can't just put all the burden on youth, where we're preparing them so much so they're going to be able to speak, but it's also about making those spaces, youth friendly, and making those professionals kind of adapt and change so that youth will be able to share freely. And that can be a lot harder.
Yeah, absolutely. Haley just said in the chat, and we need to support them after they share their story, check in with them, self-care, etc. They should also get some kind of compensation. Yeah, we always made sure that youth were getting some sort of a stipend or payment or something like that. Because again, all the professionals in the room, as Lisa mentioned, they're being paid to be there. They're being paid for their time. Youth coming and sharing their stories with us is a privilege for us, not necessarily for them, right? So
I think the other type of payments or assistance should be like transportation. It shouldn't be part of the stipend. The stipend theory is, oh, we'll give you a stipend and you pay for your childcare, and if you're a young parent, or you pay for transportation, which could be quite expensive depending where you live, especially like in a rural area. So in addition to the stipend, there should be supports around transportation, around childcare, or any other barrier, interpreters if needed. We don't always, even if the audience is primarily English speaking, it's okay to have someone speaking in Spanish or in Arabic, and then have an interpreter there, and we pay for that interpreter to be sharing, and the audience listens to the young person sharing in their own indigenous language.
absolutely, 100%. Yeah, there needs to be supports outside of the stipend to make sure that we're accessible to youth and families, right? And sometimes too, that's thinking about a trauma-informed approach. Like, are we having these meetings at a DHS office? And maybe that's not going to be super comfortable for young people and families. Or are we having it in a more public space that feels accessible, fun, things like that? Yeah, I think that that's a great point. These are all great discussions, everybody. So we only have 5 minutes left, but we do have 3 scenarios that I was hoping to get through. I think with that, I'll send you the final 2. But we'll go through these scenarios first. And we've been talking a lot about advocacy, so I think I'm going to mix it up. And I'd like the whole group to kind of review this scenario and then talk about how a youth peer might be able to address the situation, or perhaps the supervisor address the situation. So I'll give you about a minute to read it over, and then we can go ahead and discuss.
Is it possible to put scenarios in the chat? Is it possible to put the scenarios in the chat? To post the scenarios in the chat?
Yes, I can post that. Yes, I'll post the other 2 in the chat. Has everybody had time to review this scenario? And so what do you think? How do you think maybe you could redirect the youth, or how can the youth peer address this situation?
You could say that you're still in recovery, and that talking about details like that are activating or triggering to you. And then you could redirect it back to them by saying, you know, I'm here to support you in what you're going through. Is there something like along those lines that you were wanting to talk about? And just kind of, if you're working with a youth who's struggling with that, and like you're still kind of going through your process too, just having the boundaries like in advance, and knowing like where's your line of like what you're comfortable sharing and what you're not, and what might just be like too detailed that it's not helpful to the youth, or that it's triggering to you.
Yeah, I
You
really
said
like
it better,
that.
Haley. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Maria.
No, I was just gonna say I really like bringing it back to, well, I'm in recovery, so that is actually triggering for me to talk about, because it points out to the young person that recovery is an ongoing process, right? And that you're still active, and it's not like just a one and done type of thing. And it's also modeling like good boundaries to the young person as well. And I like, kind of redirecting it back to them, like kind of trying to figure out what was the need behind that question exactly. Maybe there was something that they wanted to talk about. So I think that's great.
Yeah, and I love that your response too, there is nothing about it where, we are shaming the youth or lecturing the young person or anything. It's actually just creating a space to like normalize recovery. And also recovery means that some things are still going to be activating, right? So yeah, I thought that was great. And then I did drop the other 2 scenarios in the chat. I don't know if folks got to review those. Oh, Robert to this one says, I would say something like, I don't mind sharing my recovery process, but I prefer to share with you about the positive parts of staying sober. Yeah, I think that redirection is great too, where it's like, let's talk more about like what are some of the positive aspects, right? And it's a good way to show them too that you have control of your story, which is good modeling for them as well. And then Lisa said, I probably want to know why they are asking and share that I did
Mhm.
feel comfortable with and how my times were driven by hiding or trying to cope with other things. Is there something that they need to share or explore? Yeah, I
Yes.
love like coming back and asking them, like putting the focus back on them, like what are we exploring with these questions, right? Yeah, that's great, everybody. Well, we are right at 11. So before we wrap up, I do just want to remind folks that we will have an evaluation survey that is going to be sent out today in a follow-up email. If you could go ahead and fill that out, that would be super helpful. It really helps us learn about what kind of topics folks want to learn about, and just helps us better tailor these calls to you all. And then finally, these are the various areas where you can get some of our more free TA, as well as trainings, or ask us any questions. And this was a really lovely call today. I thank everybody for coming and participating, and we hope to see you all next month.
Yeah, thank you all for your participation.
Bye, everyone.